It was a cold, rainy night when Emily walked into the diner for her first night shift. The diner was small, with only a few tables and a counter. The lights flickered above her, and she shivered, even though she was wearing her warmest jacket. She had just moved to the small town of Hollow Creek for college and needed a job to make some extra money. She found the ad for the diner in the local newspaper and thought it would be a good fit. The diner was called Hollow Creek Eats. It was old, but well known in town, mostly because it stayed open 24 hours. Locals loved it for its cozy atmosphere, and the food was good, simple, home-style meals. But there was something off about it. Emily didn't know what it was yet, but she had heard rumors. Her boss, a grumpy man named Sam, showed her around. He was tall, with rough hands and a weathered face that seemed permanently tired. He didn't smile much, but he was kind enough to show her how to use the register and where everything was. Emily noticed that Sam kept glancing nervously at the kitchen doors, and he warned her, "Stay out of the kitchen when it's closed, especially after midnight. Just don't." The other worker, a woman named Lily, was more welcoming. She'd been working at the diner for years and offered Emily some tips about dealing with the strange customers that came in late at night. "Most of them are harmless," Lily said, wiping down the counter. "But if someone orders the soup of the day, make sure to give them extra bread. Just trust me." Emily nodded, unsure what Lily meant but deciding not to question it. She wanted to make a good impression. As the evening passed, the diner started to fill up. A couple of truck drivers sat in the corner booth, talking quietly. An old man, wearing a faded coat, sat at the counter, sipping coffee and staring out the window. The rain grew heavier outside, and Emily felt the cold creeping into the diner, making the air thick with dampness. It wasn't long before something strange happened. The diner's doorbell jingled, and a man in a long black coat walked in. He looked out of place, as if he had just stepped out of a movie. His face was pale, and his eyes were hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He walked straight to the counter, ignoring the empty tables. Emily was about to ask if he wanted to sit down when he spoke first. "Coffee. Black," he said in a low, raspy voice. Emily froze. She had never seen this man before. He didn't look like anyone from the town. She quickly poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him. He didn't look up or acknowledge her at all. Emily thought he was a little odd, but didn't think too much about it. Then the lights flickered. "Don't mind the lights," Sam called from the kitchen, his voice a little too loud. "It happens every now and then. Power's a little unstable in this part of town." Emily nodded, but the flickering didn't feel normal. It felt wrong, like the diner itself was holding its breath. The rest of the night passed quietly, and Emily began to feel more comfortable in her new role. The regulars came and went, some friendly, others lost in their own worlds. But as the clock struck midnight, things started to change. A woman in a long coat came in. She was wearing dark glasses despite the fact that it was nighttime. Emily thought it was strange, but she didn't say anything. The woman sat at a corner booth and ordered a bowl of soup. Emily remembered Lily's warning and made sure to give her extra bread, just like she had been told. The woman smiled a little when Emily set the bowl down. "Thank you," she said softly. Emily nodded and walked back to the counter. As she stood there, she noticed the woman's bowl of soup. There was something wrong with it. It looked darker than usual. The steam that rose from it didn't feel warm. It felt cold, as though it had been sitting there for hours. Before Emily could say anything, the woman raised her spoon to her lips and took a long, slow sip. Her eyes closed in pleasure, and then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Perfect, just like before." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what she was supposed to say to that. The woman's voice had sounded so familiar, like she had said those words hundreds of times. But how could that be? Emily had never seen her before. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. Emily jumped, and the woman at the booth didn't even flinch. Sam appeared in the doorway, looking tense. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, trying to hide her nervousness. "Yeah," Sam said, wiping his hands on his apron. Just a little accident with a pan. Nothing to worry about." But Emily could tell something was wrong. The way Sam kept glancing at the clock, the way his eyes flickered nervously as he looked at the woman in the corner, told her that he knew something she didn't. As the clock ticked closer to 1 a.m., more and more strange customers arrived. They were all dressed in long coats, their faces hidden under hoods or hats. Emily started to feel a sense of dread creeping over her. She couldn't explain it, but something wasn't right. One of the customers, a man in a dark gray suit, sat at the counter and ordered coffee. Emily noticed his hands. They were shaking, but he was trying to hide it. The doorbell jingled again, and another figure stepped inside. It was a tall man with wide, empty eyes, his skin a sickly shade of gray. His clothes were torn, and he dragged a heavy suitcase behind him. He walked straight to the counter, ignoring everyone else, and sat next to the shaking man. Emily was too frightened to move. Her heart raced as the tall man stared at her with those empty eyes. She had never seen anyone like him before. Before she could say anything, the man spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Emily froze. "What?" But the man didn't answer. He just stared at her, his eyes darkening like a storm cloud. Sam appeared from the kitchen again, his face pale. "Is everything okay, Sam?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah, everything's fine," Sam said quickly, but he wasn't convincing. Just stay away from the customers tonight, okay?" Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen. As the clock ticked closer to 2 a.m., the diner seemed to grow colder, darker. The strange customers continued to arrive, each one more unsettling than the last. Some of them whispered to each other in languages Emily couldn't understand. Others stared at her with cold, unblinking eyes, making her skin crawl. Then, just before 3 a.m., the door opened again, and a tall man stepped inside. This one was different. His eyes weren't just empty, they were black, pitch black, as if there was no light in them at all. He walked slowly to the counter, his heavy boots echoing on the floor. Emily's breath caught in her throat as he sat down right in front of her. "I'm here," the man said, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. Emily didn't know what to say. There was something about him that made her feel like her very soul was being pulled toward him. It was as if he had been waiting for her all. Before she could say anything, Sam appeared, his face ashen. I think it's time for you to go, Emily." Emily turned to him, confused. "What? Why? I'm fine." "No, you're not," Sam said urgently. "You don't understand. You're part of something bigger than this diner. You're not supposed to be here." Emily felt a cold chill sweep over her. The man with the black eyes was watching her now, waiting for something. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking. Sam opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the man with the black eyes raised his hand. The diner's lights flickered violently, and then, suddenly, everything went dark. The diner was plunged into total darkness. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled for the light switch. Her hands were trembling, and the silence in the room felt like a heavy weight. She could hear the sound of her own breath, but everything else was still. There were no sounds of rain outside, no ticking of the old clock on the wall, nothing. Just a suffocating silence. "Sam?" Emily's voice broke the silence, but it felt small and fragile. "What's going on?" She could hear Sam moving around in the dark, his footsteps heavy and slow. Then she heard the creak of the kitchen door open. "I'm sorry." Sam's voice came from the darkness, low and filled with fear. "I tried to warn you, but I didn't have much time. You shouldn't have taken the job here, Emily. None of us should have." "What are you talking about?" Emily asked, trying to calm herself. "What's happening?" The man with the black eyes didn't answer. He remained still, though Emily could feel his presence like a dark shadow creeping closer. She swallowed, trying to steady her breath. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, revealing the room in a sickly dim light. Everything looked normal, but Emily knew something had changed. The air felt thick, as if it was charged with something dark and ancient. Sam was standing near the counter, his face pale and worn. His eyes were wide with terror. He looked at Emily, his expression filled with regret. "This diner," Sam whispered, "it's not just a diner. It's a place where things happen, things we don't understand. And it's too late for me, but you can still leave. Go while you can." Emily looked around the room trying to understand. The customers, who had been quietly sipping their coffee, eating their meals, had all stopped moving. They sat frozen, their eyes locked on Emily. It was like they were waiting for something to happen, something only they knew. "Sam, what are you saying? What's going on here?" Emily's voice was rising, but her fear was making it harder to think clearly. The man with the black eyes finally spoke, his voice low and haunting. "You don't belong here, girl. None of you do. This place is cursed, A place where the past never lets go, where people come and they stay. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. What do you mean, stay? The man's lips curled into a smile that sent chills down her spine. Not everyone who comes here leaves. Some are trapped. And some, he paused, some are meant to return. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. The diner's walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and Emily felt the temperature drop. The cold seeped into her skin, and she shivered violently. The old clock on the wall chimed, though Emily could see that the hands hadn't moved. Sam looked at her one last time. Get out, now. Before Emily could react, a loud crash echoed from the back of the diner. She spun around, her eyes widening. The door to the kitchen had been thrown open, and a dark figure stepped into the light. It was Lily. But Lily wasn't Lily anymore. Her skin was pale and cracked, like old porcelain, and her eyes were wide and empty, devoid of any recognition. She looked more like a puppet, moving stiffly and unnaturally as she walked toward Emily. Her mouth opened, and a voice that wasn't hers came. Too late, Emily. You're already a part of us now. The air thickened with a suffocating sense of dread. Emily tried to step back, but her legs wouldn't move. It felt like invisible hands were holding her in place. Run, Emily, Sam shouted, his voice shaking with desperation. Don't let them take... But it was already too late. Lily's cold hands reached out, grabbing Emily's arm with a strength that felt unnatural. Emily gasped, struggling to break free, but it was like her limbs had turned to stone. The other customers stood up now, their eyes wide and blank, and they slowly began to surround her. The man with the black eyes grinned, his smile twisted and cold. Emily's mind raced. What was happening? Why was everyone frozen in place, trapped in this nightmare? Sam, help me! Emily screamed, but Sam was too far away. He was paralyzed with fear, his face etched with guilt. The darkness in the diner seemed to grow, the shadows stretching out like arms, reaching for her. She felt her breath catch in her throat as the cold tightened its grip around. Lily's voice came again, and this time it wasn't just a whisper, it was a command. Come with us. Before Emily could scream, the shadows engulfed. When Emily opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the diner. The world around her was dark and twisted, a place that didn't look like anything she had ever seen. It was a strange, empty void, filled with faint echoes of voices, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Her body felt weightless, as though she was floating in a sea of shadows. She tried to move, but she couldn't feel her limbs. Panic surged through her chest, and she opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She wasn't alone. She felt a presence beside her, and when she turned, she saw the faces of the other customers. They were all here, their eyes hollow, their mouths frozen in empty expressions. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. The fear in their eyes told Emily everything she needed. You're one of us now, a voice whispered in her ear. Emily spun around, but no one was there. Her heart raced as she realized that the voice came from within her own mind. It was a thought, a dark realization that she couldn't escape. Sam, she whispered, but there was no response. He was gone. There was nothing but the endless darkness and the faces of those who had come before her, trapped in this place, trapped just like her. The man with the black eyes stepped forward, his figure emerging from the shadows. His smile stretched wider, impossibly so, until it was a grotesque, twisted mockery of human expression. You'll never leave, Emily. Not now, not after all of this. Emily felt the darkness close in on her. The diner, the strange customers, the terrifying things that had happened, they were all part of something much larger, much darker. And now, she was a part of it. She had become one of the souls trapped in Hollow Creek Eats, and she would never escape. It was a chilly autumn evening when Mia stepped into the diner for her first night shift. She had just moved to the small town of Ravensbrook, and the diner was the only place hiring. It was called Marion's Diner, and despite the faded sign and worn-down furniture, it had an old-school charm that Mia liked. The town was quiet. It had that sleepy feeling, the kind of place where nothing much happened, but at night, things felt different. Mia had heard a few strange rumors from the locals about the diner. Some said it had been around for decades, even longer. Others whispered that something was off about it, but Mia didn't pay much attention. She needed the job, and it was the only place in town hiring. Inside, the diner was cozy. The bright lights from the neon sign outside illuminated the walls. The checkered floors shined under the fluorescent lights, and the smell of coffee and fried food mixed in the air. At the counter, there were a few customers, all older men who sat alone. The waitress, an older woman with gray hair, was wiping down the... "Hi, I'm Mia," she said nervously as she approached the counter. The waitress, named Joan, smiled kindly. "You must be the new girl. Welcome to Marion's. I'll show you the road." Joan gave Mia a quick rundown of how the diner worked, but most of it was pretty simple. Take orders, serve food, and clean. Joan seemed nice enough, though her eyes were a bit sad, like she had seen too many things in her lifetime. "There's not much to do in Ravensbrook," Joan said, her voice low. "But people come here when they need something more than..." Mia nodded, but didn't ask what Joan meant. She figured it was just small-town talk. As the evening wore on, the diner grew quieter. The rain started to pour outside, and the wind howled through the streets. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, and Mia grew restless. She had never worked a late-night shift before, and something about the silence in the diner made her uneasy. Just as she was about to ask Joan if she could go home early, the door to the diner opened with a loud jingle. The man was tall, wearing a long black coat that seemed out of place for the weather. His shoes were covered in mud, and his hair was soaked from the rain. He looked strange, like he didn't belong in the town. He didn't even look at Mia as he walked in, just went straight to the counter and sat down on the far end. Joan didn't say anything. Mia, however, couldn't help but watch him. There was something about his presence that made the air feel colder, heavier. "Coffee," the man muttered when Joan walked up to him. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. Joan nodded and poured him a cup without a word. Mia continued to watch him, trying to shake the strange feeling that had settled in her chest. There was something wrong about the way he looked. His eyes were sunken, and his skin was pale, almost too pale. It was like he hadn't seen the sun in years. As Joan walked back to the counter, Mia couldn't help but ask, "Do you know him?" Joan shook. "I've seen him around, but not recently, not in years, I think." Mia felt a shiver run down her spine. She turned to look at the man again, but when she did, he was staring straight at her. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to pierce through her, like he could see right into her soul. For a moment, Mia froze. It felt like time stopped. Then, without saying a word, the man turned back to his coffee and took a sip. She continued to clean the counter, humming quietly to herself. Mia's hands, however, were shaking slightly. She had to look away. There was something unsettling about the man, something that made her feel like she was being watched, even though he hadn't moved a muscle. The rain continued to pour outside, tapping against the windows. The clock on the wall showed that it was nearly midnight, and the diner was as quiet as it had ever been. The man hadn't said a word since he sat down, just drinking his coffee slowly, staring into space. Mia tried to focus on cleaning the tables, but every time she looked back at the man, he seemed even more strange. His coat was dripping wet, but it didn't seem to be getting the counter wet at all. His hands, too, were unnaturally still. He hadn't moved since he sat down. Then, the doorbell jangled again, and Mia turned to see a second figure entering the diner. This one was different. She was a woman, tall and thin, with long dark hair that seemed to float behind her like a shadow. She wore a long white dress that looked old, almost like it belonged to another time. The woman didn't speak a word. She simply walked to the back booth and sat down, her eyes never leaving the man at the counter. Mia felt a chill run through her. The woman's eyes were wide, and there was something unnatural about them. The darkness in her gaze felt like it reached deep into Mia's soul. "Who is she?" Mia whispered to Joan. Joan didn't answer right away. She seemed lost in thought. "I don't know," she said finally. "But she's one of..." Mia didn't understand. "One of who?" Joan didn't have a chance to explain. The woman stood up suddenly, her movements jerky, like she was being controlled by something unseen. She walked up to the counter, and Mia's heart raced. The woman stopped beside the man in the black coat, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in a low voice that seemed to echo in Mia's mind, the woman whispered, "It's time." The man stood up slowly. His eyes met Mia's again, and this time, there was no mistaking the fear that flickered in his gaze. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver key, handing it to her with shaking hands. "Lock the door," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Mia's mind raced. What was happening? The man and the woman had never spoken to her before, but now they were giving her commands. Why was she supposed to lock the door? As the man and the woman moved toward the door, Mia hesitated. She held the key tightly in her hand. What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed the door handle, and the man stepped outside into the pouring rain. But just as the door was about to close behind them, the air seemed to freeze. Time seemed to stand still. Then Mia heard it. A soft whisper, like the wind carrying a secret, echoed through the diner. It wasn't coming from the man or the woman. It was coming from inside the diner itself. "Don't let them leave." Mia stood frozen behind the counter, the silver key still clutched tightly in her hand. The whisper echoed in her mind, a soft, insistent voice that sent a shiver down her spine. "Don't let them leave." She glanced back at Joan, but the older waitress didn't seem to notice anything unusual. Joan was wiping down the counter, her hands moving mechanically, as if the events unfolding around them didn't matter. Mia swallowed hard. What did that whisper mean? Who was it coming from? And why had the man and the woman been so strange? It felt like something terrible was about to happen, but Mia didn't know what. She turned slowly toward the door. The man and the woman were standing outside, just past the diner's threshold. The rain fell in sheets, and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows over the empty street. They weren't moving, as if something was holding them in place, like they were waiting for something to happen. Mia's heart raced. The whisper grew louder in her head. She could feel it now, pressing against her mind. "Lock the door, Mia. Don't let them leave." Her body moved on its own. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, and as she twisted it, the door shut with a heavy thud, trapping the man and the woman outside in the storm. The moment the door was locked, the air inside the diner seemed to shift. It grew colder, and the lights flickered. Mia could hear the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears, but all she could do was stand there, watching. Suddenly, the woman outside started to move. She turned toward the door and took a step forward, but she didn't seem to be walking. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground, and her body glided unnaturally through the rain. "Mia," from behind her, making Mia jump. "You shouldn't have done that." Mia turned to face Joan, who looked almost sad. There was something in her eyes, a kind of regret. "What's happening, Joan? Who are those people?" Joan looked at her, her face pale. "They're not people, Mia. They're something else. They're not supposed to come in. No one is supposed to come in after midnight." Mia's mind raced. "What do you mean, not supposed to come in? Are they? Are they dangerous?" Joan's eyes darted toward the door, where the woman was now standing just outside. The woman's face was completely expressionless, but her eyes locked onto Mia with a cold, unblinking gaze. "They're part of the diner's curse," Joan whispered, her voice trembling. "The diner, it traps people. It doesn't let them." Mia felt her stomach twist. "What do you mean it traps people?" Joan had and stepped closer. "This diner, it's not just a place to eat. It's a place where time and reality get twisted. Every midnight the diner comes alive, and it takes what it needs. Most people don't realize it, but there's a price for everything here. You can't leave once you enter." Mia looked at her confused. "But I haven't done anything wrong. I just started working here." Joan's voice lowered even more, barely a whisper. "That's just it. You don't have to do anything. The diner chooses you, Mia. It always has. And once it has you, it won't let go." The room fell on Mia, the walls pressing against her. She turned back to the door. The woman was still there, standing in the rain, staring at her. But now, the man was nowhere to be seen. Mia's breath caught in her throat. "Mia," Joan warned, grabbing her arm. "Get away from the windows. Don't let them in. It's too late for them. But you can still..." Before Joan could finish, the door suddenly rattled. A loud thud echoed through the diner, followed by another. Then, there was a soft scraping sound, as if something or someone was dragging itself across the floor outside. Mia's eyes widened. She turned to the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she tried to peer outside. The woman was gone, but in her place stood the man. His face was now twisted in a grotesque expression, his eyes black as coal, his skin as pale as bone. He was staring at the diner, his face pressed against the window, his lips moving in silent whispers. "Open the door, Mia," he mouthed, his voice a low hiss that sent a chill down her spine. "Don't let," her voice trembling. "They want in. They always want in." Suddenly, the man let out a terrible screech, a sound that made Mia's stomach churn. The glass of the window cracked, and for a moment, it seemed like the world itself was being pulled apart. Everything stopped. The man stepped, his expression still frozen in that twisted, horrifying smile, but there was no sound, no movement. Just silence. Mia's hand, her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Joan was standing behind her, her hands tightly gripping the counter. "Joan, Mia finally demanded, her voice breaking. "Who are they? Why is this happening?" Joan didn't respond right away. Her eyes were fixed on the man outside, her face pale and strained. They are the ones who came before you. They came here looking for answers, or maybe for something they didn't even understand. But the diner doesn't let people leave. It takes..." Mia felt a lump form in her throat. "Takes them? What do you mean? What happens to them?" Joan turned to us, filled with sorrow. "The diner keeps them, traps their souls. Every time someone new comes in, it takes them too. It feeds on their fears, their regrets. It keeps them trapped in its grip. The man outside, he's one of the ones who came in before you. He's been here for years, and he'll never leave." Mia felt her knees go weak, and she had to steady herself against the counter. "What happens to them once they're trapped?" she asked, her voice barely. Joan's eyes were haunted. "They become part of the diner. They stay here, waiting for the next person to come in. And when they do, the diner pulls them in too." Suddenly, the man at the window moved again. His hand reached up to the glass, and with a single swipe, the window shattered. "Mia, we have to go. Now." But it was too late. The man had already stepped inside. Mia's heart pounded in her chest as the man stepped inside the diner. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. His eyes never left Mia's, and though his mouth was closed, she could hear the low, growling whispers in her mind. "Let me in, Mia. Let me in." The voice was not his. It was something older, something deeper, like the echo of 1,000 voices layered together. She tried to back away, but the air seemed thicker now, suffocating. Her legs felt heavy, like she was walking through water. Joan grabbed her arm tightly, her grip strong despite her age. "Get back," Joan whispered, her voice trembling. "You have to run, Mia. Don't let it." The man's hand reached up, and with unnatural speed, his fingers wrapped around the edge of the door, pushing it open. "Don't let them. Take me," the man whispered, his voice full of desperation. His features twisted in agony as he stepped further into the diner. He wasn't human anymore. He wasn't even alive. His skin was thin, almost translucent, revealing veins that pulsed with black energy. His eyes were hollow, pits of darkness that seemed to drag the light out of the room. He had become something else, a lost soul, forever bound to the diner. Mia's breath caught in her throat. What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The terror that gripped her made it hard to breathe. The man opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Instead, the room seemed to vibrate with a low hum, and Mia felt the air around her thicken. It was like the diner itself was alive, pushing against her, closing in. "We don't want anything from you," Joan said, her voice now calm, though fear still flickered in her eyes. "It's not about you, Mia. It's about the diner. It's always been about the..." Mia turned toward Joan, confusion and fear flooding her. "What do you mean? What does the diner want?" Joan's face was drawn, her hands shaking as she looked back at the man now standing inside the diner. "The diner feeds off of souls, Mia. It traps them, takes them, and never lets them leave. Every soul that enters here becomes part of it, part of the never-ending cycle. They are its sustenance." Mia stand. "Sustenance? But that man, he's just a person. He's trapped, isn't he?" Joan nodded grimly. "Yes, he was just like you once, a new employee desperate for work, but the diner doesn't care about your life. It doesn't care about your past or your future. It only cares about what it can take from you." Mia stepped back slowly, feeling like the walls were closing in around her. The man's hollow eyes followed her every move, but there was no warmth in them. He wasn't a person anymore. He was a shadow of something far darker. Mia, pleading, "You have to understand, the diner. It's been here for generations. It's been waiting for someone like you to come in. It needs fresh souls to keep feeding, and it doesn't care how it gets them." Mia felt her chest tighten as the air grew colder. She turned toward the door, hoping to escape, but the moment she moved, the man lurched forward, his long skeletal fingers stretching toward her. "No," Mia shouted, stepping back. "I'm not like you. I'm not staying here." But before the diner's lights flickered violently, and the room seemed to twist. The floor beneath her feet felt uneven, as if the very building was shifting. Then, with a loud bang, the door to the diner slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. The diner seemed to pulse, as though the walls were breathing. Mia felt a sharp, biting cold, and the air felt heavier, thicker. She turned quickly, searching for an exit, but there was nothing. The windows were blacked out now, the glass reflecting nothing but dark. "Mia, there's no escaping," Joan said, her voice full of sorrow. "Once you lock the door, there's no leaving. The diner will never let you go." Mia turned. "What do you mean? I can't stay here. I can't be a part of this." Joan took a deep breath, her eyes haunted. "I didn't want to tell you, but you need to understand. When the diner takes you, it doesn't just take your body, it takes your soul. You become part of it, part of this twisted, endless cycle." The man, no, the creature, lurched forward again, his face twisted in agony, his eyes locked on Mia's, his mouth opening to let out a soundless scream. Mia backed away, but her feet felt heavy, as though the ground was pulling her toward him. The whispers filled her mind again, louder this time, urging her to come closer. "Mia," Joan whispered urgently, "there's no way out once the cycle begins, but you can still make it stop. If you want to save yourself, you have to break the cycle. You have to stop feeding the diner." Mia stared at her and what Joan was saying. "How do I stop it? How do I get out?" Joan's eyes flickered toward the man, and for a moment, she looked lost in thought. The diner feeds on fear, on regret, on the darkness inside us. If you want to escape, you have to confront that darkness. You have to face the thing the diner is feeding off of, the thing you're afraid of. Mia's head spun, but she knew she had no choice. The whispers were getting louder, overwhelming her thoughts. "Mia," Joan said, her voice now shaking. "You have to face it, even if it means confronting your past. If you don't, you'll become just like them, just another lost soul." Mia's mind raced. Could she really fight the diner, whatever it was? Could she face the thing she feared the most? The shadows in the corners of the diner seemed to grow darker as the whispers swirled around her, growing louder and more frantic. With shaking hands, Mia walked to the center of the diner. The man, no, the thing, continued to move closer, its eyes glowing with malice. The air grew colder still, and the lights flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. "Face it, Mia," Joan urged. "You have to face your fear." Mia closed her eyes and tried to focus. The diner, the creature, the whispers, they all seemed to blur together. What was it that the diner wanted from her? What was the thing she feared most? And then, suddenly, it hit her. It wasn't just the diner she feared. It was the lonely isolation, the fear that she would never find a place where she truly belonged. She feared being trapped forever, just like the man and woman who had come before her. But the diner, it thrived on the darkness inside her. Mia opened her eyes. It wasn't enough to run. She had to confront it, confront her own fear. With a shake, "I won't let you control me. I won't let you feed on me." The man's twisted face contorted in rage as the diner trembled around her, but Mia stood her ground. Slowly, the air began to shift. The whispers faded. The man recoiled, as if the very act of confronting her fear had caused him pain. Then, there was silence. The diner stopped breathing. The silence was deafening. For a moment, Mia thought she had failed, that the creature would come for her, that the cycle would continue, and she would be trapped forever. But then, something incredible happened. The man's form began to dissipate, slowly fading like smoke in the air. The walls of the diner seemed to exhale a deep, mournful sigh. Joan looked at Mia, a sad but relieved expression on her face. "You did it," she whispered. Mia looked around. The diner was still old, still empty, but the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. The whispers were gone. The man, the creature, was no longer. But Mia knew she wasn't free. The diner's curse would never truly end, and there were always others who would walk into its trap. She could feel the eyes of those who had come before her, the souls of the lost. She could feel them watching, waiting for someone else to take her place. But at last, she was free. Mia stood in the now silent diner, her body trembling but relieved. The oppressive darkness that had filled the room moments before had lifted, leaving only the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights above. She looked around at the empty booths, the tables, and the faded walls that had witnessed the horrors of so many before her. But for the first time since she had stepped into this place, she felt a sense of peace. Joan's entire ordeal unfold now stood beside her, a quiet sadness in her eyes. "It's over," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Mia nodded as if the situation hung heavily on her heart. "But it's never really over, is it?" she asked. Her voice cracked, as if the realization of what she had done was beginning to set in. "This place, it won't stop, will it?" Joan glancing at the dark window where the storm had now ceased. The street outside was empty, devoid of any signs of life. "No," Joan said, her voice low. "The diner will always be here. It always has been. It feeds on the lost, the broken, the ones who have nowhere else to go. The only way to truly break the cycle would be to destroy it, to burn it to the ground. But that would require more than just a match." Mia looked at her, confusion and uncertainty clouding her thoughts. "Then what? What do I do now?" Joan placed at her. "You've made the choice, Mia. You've faced your fears and broken free. But the diner, it doesn't let go easily. It will try again. It will always try." Mia felt it had been a terrible experience, but it had also been one that changed her. She now knew what it meant to face her own darkness, to confront the things that held her back. But in the back of her mind, she knew that the diner was still out there, waiting for the next lost soul to wander in. "I can't stay here," Mia said, her voice firm with a determination she hadn't had before. "I can't let this place claim anyone else. I have to leave." Joan's face softened with understanding. "You can leave, Mia, but don't be fooled. The diner may let you walk out of here, but it's always watching. It will always be waiting. And one day, you may have to face it." Mia looked at the door, knowing she could walk out and never look back. But deep down, she knew that the choice wasn't truly hers alone. The diner had marked her. It would always call to her. "I'll leave," Mia said, her voice steady now. "But I won't forget. I won't let anyone else suffer like I did. I'll make sure no one else ends up trapped in this place." Joan smiled faintly. "That's the spirit, Mia. But remember, the diner chooses when it's ready to claim its next soul. Until then, you live, you fight, and you keep." With one last glance around the diner, Mia walked toward the door. She reached for the handle and paused, her hand resting on the cold metal. For a moment, she felt a chill, a whisper of something darker that lingered just beyond her reach, but she pushed the feeling aside. The door creaked open, and Mia stepped outside into the quiet night. The air was cool, and the rain had stopped. The street was empty, the silence so profound that it almost felt unnatural. As Mia looked back at the diner one last time, she felt the weight of everything that had happened there. The curse of the diner had tried to claim her, to twist her into one of its lost souls. But she had fought back. For now she was free. But in the back of her mind, she knew that the diner would never truly let her go. It would always wait for the next soul to wander in, to step into its trap, and Mia would always be there, watching from the shadows, making sure no one else fell victim to its hunger. The diner would never stop, but neither would she. Years passed, and Mia moved on with her life. She found new work, made new friends, and slowly, the memory of the diner began to fade. But there were nights when she would lie awake, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her. One evening, while driving through a quiet town, Mia found herself drawn to a familiar place. The neon sign gleamed in the distance, casting a soft glow on the wet pavement. She slowed the car, her heart racing. It couldn't be. Not again. The diner. It was there. But she was no longer the frightened girl who had entered all those years ago. She was stronger now, and she knew what she had to do. Mia parked the car, stepped out into the rain, and walked toward the diner with steady, purposeful steps. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside. The air felt thick, like something was waiting for her. The whispers had already started, faint but growing louder. But Mia wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced her fears, and she wasn't going to let this place take anyone else. Not while she still had breath in her lungs. As she stepped further inside, the door slammed shut behind her. But this time, Mia wasn't running. She had come to finish what she started. And this time, she would make sure the diner's curse was broken for good.